Research and Engineering Laboratory. That's where Jeremy and I both work. I actually sit physically here. Jeremy's out in Colorado. So let's just get this to advance. Okay, yeah, so we'll give you an overview of CRREL. We'll talk about some of the resources we have here, including the ICM database and some select technical publications that we have. So just bigger picture, CRREL is part of the ERDIC family of Army laboratories. So ERDIC is the Engineer Research and Development Center. Kind of center of gravity of ERDIC is at the former Waterways Experiment Station, which some of you might be familiar with, down in Vicksburg, Mississippi. And some of CRREL sister labs are located there, including CHL, the Coastal Hydraulics Lab, EL, the Environmental Lab, there's GSL, Geotechnical and Structures Lab, and ITL, which is the Information and Technology Lab. And then there's a couple other satellite labs in addition to CRREL. There's CRREL, which is a construction-focused laboratory in Champaign, Illinois, and the Geospatial Research Lab in Alexandria, Virginia. So CRREL is located up here in Hanover, New Hampshire, along the banks of the Connecticut River, near Dartmouth College. We have facilities in Alaska as well, located in Fort Wainwright. So this slide just goes into a little bit of detail about the various groups that are at CRREL. I won't read all this, but the point is there's a lot of different stuff that goes on at CRREL. It includes people working on geospatial and remote sensing work. There's a lot of folks that support civil works within USACE, things like dams and levees. There are people working on things like soil microbes and pheromones released by plants. There's people evaluating the mobility of vehicles on snow and frozen ground. There's a full geotech lab here with folks focusing on concrete and pavements. And there's a whole group of people that work on things like signal processing and electromagnetic wave propagation and stuff that I definitely don't understand. And there's the TCSB branch as well as the terrestrial and cryospheric branch, and there's a number of renowned snow and ice scientists and engineers that work in Arctic and polar regions, in Greenland and Antarctica, Alaska as well. But down in Greenland, looking at things like, or in Antarctica, looking at things like crevasse detection, and all over the world looking at sea ice movement. We've got a number of unique facilities. You can see our campus on the upper left here along the Connecticut River. So that's kind of our main campus. We've got cold rooms that allow scientists to do bench experiments down to like 40 C. The kind of exciting picture down there on the right is the geophysical research facility, which is where a lot of under ice oil spill mitigation and corralling and burning goes on. So it can be kind of exciting here. Some days you'll see these huge towers of flame and smoke out back, and it's just people burning oil. So jumping around geographically a little bit, on the top left is the Permafrost Research Facility and Tunnel up in Fox. Some of you might be familiar with that or have gone there before. It's not too far away from some of you. So this is a unique facility tunneled through permafrost and allows scientists and engineers to have up-close experiments and going on in a permafrost environment. There's a few other research spaces back here at CRREL that allow our researchers to conduct experiments in cold environments. So we've got the Frost Effects Lab, which is on the bottom left there, that allows geotech engineers to create frozen ground conditions for testing vehicle mobility or concreting pavements. It's a refrigerated building with soil test beds, and there's been some thermosiphon testing there recently, for example. And then on the bottom right is the ice engineering facility, where a lot of experimental work has gone on over the years on vessel ice interaction, oil spill mitigation, and things like ice control structure and ice shoving effects on riprap. There's a submarine conning tower coming through there too. They've done some studies on things like that there as well. So moving away from the physical resources, CRREL has a lot of information resources too that are of interest to people who work in cold regions, like probably pretty much everybody on the call. I'm going to go through a few that are specific to river and lake ice issues, but I've touched on a lot of the other groups at CRREL, and there's just an incredible amount of knowledge available here from either people that are still here or people that have worked here in the past. And it covers lots of different areas of science and engineering that has a cross-section with cold regions. So if anybody has a question about something that doesn't seem to be related to rivers and ice, but is related to cold regions, feel free to reach out to Jeremy or I, and we can probably link you up with somebody here at CRREL that can, either be a subject matter expert for you to ask some questions, or can give you direction. But I'll start here with some specific examples with probably the most topical resource we have, and that's the USACE or CRREL ICM database. It's been around for about 30 years, and the principal purpose is to provide information about ICMs to USACE headquarters and the divisions and the districts. The database is a central repository of ICM related data, and is used for weekly situation briefings held at USACE headquarters in a near real-time sense, basically a constantly updated snapshot of the ICM situation around the country. There are some localities that do a really nice job of this at a local level. Alaska in particular has some phenomenal resources provided by the Weather Service, and those folks are way closer to the action than we are. So we really rely on information from local reporters and local experts to help us provide the big picture to our leadership at USACE. The ICM has kind of a secondary and an arguably equal important function as a database. It's in the name. It's a place to store information and query it as needed. So the ICM database is a first stop for anybody interested in a history of ICMs at a specific location in order to potentially quantify the number of events that have occurred at a location for developing a hazard mitigation plan, or as the basis of potentially seeking funding to develop some sort of a mitigation strategy. There's over 23,000 ICMs in CONUS and AK as well, and the data is publicly available through the link that's on the screen here. So some sources of information. An entry that's in the ICM database may have come from a number of different places during the active part of the season. We have staff here that monitor reports from National Weather Service offices, and these are what we look at, on a day-to-day basis, like what are the individual offices reporting, read the forecast discussions and that sort of information. And these are they key us into developing situations, and that could lead to ICM formation in a forecast sense, and provide us with information about actual ICM formation and flooding that's occurring on the ground. So we cross-reference that data with real-time gauge information, often data from the USGS, and we also monitor online news sources. And increasingly, we're using social media. There's a lot of information that's coming in that way to flesh out the picture of what's going on the ground. So we've been able to capture smaller impact events through social media as well, stuff that might not make it into like local news or something, and it allows us to kind of fill out the database a little more. And we have, throughout the Corps, we've got a vast emergency management structure in the divisions and districts, so we're in contact with EM officials within the Corps, and we put out a weekly river ice update. It goes out to several hundred people who have signed up for that distribution, and through that interaction, we often get conversations going with people in the field and get information from first-hand observers that way, so that's great too. And the last source is a retrospective one. We've been engaged in a number of studies over the years where we've gone and actually looked through old newspaper stories and reviewed gauge records and tried to build out a time series or a history of ice jams at locations where they might not have been previously recorded in any sort of organized way. So through this process, we found some pretty old stuff. I think the oldest one in the database right now is from the late 1700s. I don't remember where it is, so don't ask me that, but you can probably look it up in the database. This is just the splash screen, the front page you'll see if you jump on the ICM database. And then here's some mapping. There's some mapping tools in there. So this is how it stands right now. Just a little preview. We have some plans this summer to update some of the interface. So stay tuned. There'll be some changes, hopefully in place before next ICM season. Okay, so moving on to some more resources that we have here. Like I mentioned, one of the great resources we have is the vast amount of published material that's available on many subjects related to cold region science and engineering. So I'll talk through a few of these, and hopefully these are kind of a short list of things that I use a lot. So hopefully they'll be useful to you as well. The foundational document, kind of the first stop, is the ice engineering manual. It's EM 1110-2-1612, aptly titled Ice Engineering. So this document's somewhat living. It gets updated periodically. So some of the chapters are new, some of them are older. But it's a great place to just start if you're interested in some foundational knowledge on a problem that includes hydraulic infrastructure and ice. And there's some basic information about ice processes and some specific guidance for dealing with ice-related issues, like some of the topics that we talked about this morning are covered in here. And it goes into other topics as well, like ice and navigation settings and that sort of thing. Next, we have tech notes and a series that's called Ice Engineering here. These are just some examples of kind of digest form publications that go through some practical ice engineering topics. They're a great way to get up to speed on a topic and are good for maybe a more general audience. Some of them are a little more technical than others. This River Ice Guide is a nice, easy one. It's just some pictures and description of ice terms. And then another good one is the method to estimate river ice thickness based on meteorological data, which is a nice primer on the accumulated freezing degree day method of estimating ice thickness, which we'll talk about in a later presentation. There's a lot of other technical digests and what are referred to here as special reports on various topics. They're usually pretty general documents in that they're not particular to a specific location or problem, but address some narrow technical issue. So these ones are good resources related to river ice, including review of ice control methods. There's one on structural methods and non-structural methods. Here's just another example of a specific guide on designing ice booms. So these are really commonly referenced in practical engineering calculation packages. For example, somebody designing an ice boom might reference this document. Another group of reports that are out there are write-ups on some of the kind of foundational lab experiments that have gone on at CRREL over the years. These are often kind of specific to a project, but the findings are usually pretty broadly applicable. They're of great value when seeking guidance on the design of some structure or mitigation strategy. So we often refer back to these documents as well. And our group does a lot of what we refer to as reimbursable work. We work with partners on challenging engineering problems and kind of bridge some of this laboratory research work and practical engineering problems. So our customers usually have something that they're trying to build or some operational procedure they're trying to modify to reduce the impacts of ice. So when we work through a problem and provide results of our analysis and give conclusions and recommendations, it's usually, these days, it's usually typically something that's particular to a specific site or specific problem. But a lot of the findings that we have are usually pretty broadly applicable. So we really try to formally publish as much of the information as we can, you know, in collaboration with our partners. Otherwise, sometimes this information is sort of lost to time. Or just left in some unpublished customer report that only a few people know about. So these are just some examples of relevant reports that ice engineering has published in the past few years that may be of interest to folks interested in river ice. Yeah, along the same lines of the last slide, even though we're often solving specific problems, we try to get as much of our findings out to the public as we reasonably can. We publish in peer-reviewed journals and conference proceedings. A particularly rich source I'll point you to if you're interested in river ice is the proceedings from the Committee on River Ice and the Environment, CRREL, which is a conference that happens every 2 years. And it's not a CRREL resource in itself. This is a totally independent group. However, our group routinely contributes papers to this. But there's a lot of really good practical discussion and great papers from a practical standpoint that are part of that. So a lot of the material I talked about is available through the ERDIC library, which you can see the link here. And of course, you can find a lot of stuff just by being good at doing Google. But if you're looking for something specific that's tied to CRREL and you're having trouble finding it, definitely feel free to reach out to myself, and we'll even offer up Jeremy, give him a call or send him an email, and we'll help you track down something if we can. So with that, I'll take any questions, but hopefully you know at least a little bit more about CRREL than you did when I started.
Any questions for Chandler? I put some of the links in the chat.